Hey guys, I'm WeProps, and today I'm going to show you how I made a suit of power armor from Fallout using cardboard, spackle, and a bunch of random recyclables and junk. To start off this build, I started with the chest plate, and I just traced a t-shirt shape onto a piece of cardboard, and then cut that out minus the sleeves, and then just glued the two halves of it together. And then I went through and made the chest armor portion of it, just cutting out that shape and then gluing a strip to hold the two halves of it together. And then I just went through and glued it on using some hot glue. If you're gonna make this out of cardboard and hot glue, I would suggest kind of stocking up on a little bit of both. I used about 50 or so hot glue sticks on it. I didn't really count, but I only have about 200 left in my pack at 250, so I mean, basic math. You do kind of want to stock up on stuff. This is a rather large project. Actually, I think it's probably my largest project to date. It's taken me about 3 months to make the whole thing, though I've been working on a lot of other projects as well. I also made a back plate part, just tracing a basic shape on the cardboard, cutting it out, and then wrapping the edges in some cardboard just to give it some depth. I made these little rounded parts on the edges just so that I had something to attach the shoulder pads to. It's not really part of the armor, but I needed it so that I could attach the shoulders to it. And then I just glued this on using some hot glue. I did end up going through and screwing it in with some smaller screws just to hold it in while I went through and mixed up some fiberglass for it. After that, I went through and cut up some small strips of thin cardboard and then went through and just glued those along the underside of that chest piece just to fill in that void, so that I didn't end up having to fill in that whole void with spackle. I could just fill in the little gaps left between the chest piece and the underside of the armor, and this just gives it a more of a flow look, and it ended up saving me a lot of money and time sanding. Alternatively, you could just paper mache this, but I wasn't sure how paper mache would hold up under that large of a gap, because I know it sags under when you have it under a hollow void, so I just kind of wanted to avoid that. I then went through and cut out the basic shape of the shoulder pauldron part, just leaving in two circular parts so that I could attach that to the chest plate. And then I just cut out this main bracket piece for the shoulder plate just so that I could reinforce it. And I cut out the smaller plate that goes on the shoulder pad, and I angled that down a little bit so that you could still see it, since the T51 power armor has those two kind of sub plates on the chest plate. And then I went through and covered the whole chest plate up in some thin cardboard. I just used some old beer boxes for this and just laid them on, glued them on, and then went through and cut them to shape. I ended up trying to get most of the parts covered in the underside of the cardboard just so that it would absorb the fiberglassing resin that I would give it later, but most of the cardboard I just completely forgot and ended up giving it the glossy side, which didn't really matter in the long run, but it didn't really absorb the fiberglass as well as I'd hoped. I then went through and cut out the basic shape of the shoulder or bicep armor, and I did cut in a few grooves for this, for like my armpit and elbow and all that, just so that it fit a little bit more comfortably than some of my previous armor. Then I glued that together and then cut some holes out for the joint parts, which are just cardboard tubes that I glued a small piece of cardboard on the end cap for. And then I went through and made a left side and then covered the whole thing in some thin cardboard, just gluing that on and cutting it to fit like I did for the chest plate. I am going to end up covering most of this armor in thin cardboard just so that I don't have to sand it as much. So if you don't have a lot of thin cardboard, just know that you can fill it all with spackle and then sand it. And then I made the forearm piece. This is a little bit skinnier than the one in-game, but I was running low on cardboard by this point, so I didn't really have a lot or enough to make it as thick as it is. And then I just covered that in thin cardboard. I did end up making an elbow pad. I forgot to record that, but it's just a piece of cardboard that I covered in some thin cardboard. And it's just got this little rounded shape that covers my elbow. And then I went through and made the shin armor. And I just cut this out of cardboard and then went through and laid some pieces of cardboard over it to make kind of the calf detailing. I ended up revising this shape a little bit just because it was a little too pointed for my taste. So I just cut a notch in it and then I glued the two halves back together so that it kind of curved a little more gently and wasn't as sharp. And then I also glued on a knee part. Then I covered the whole thing in some thin cardboard. This was a little bit tricky, so I cut some of it into some thinner strips just to cover some of the more narrow areas. I also made these boot parts, just cutting out some cardboard and then forming it to the shape of my shoe, and it just slides on like that. Then I went through and fiberglassed the whole thing. I just mixed up some of this fiberglass and resin that I found on Amazon for like $5. And then I went through and spread it on using some sponges. Make sure if you're going to do this to wear a respirator and protective gear like gloves and an apron so that your clothes don't get dirty. Then I went through and rubbed on some spackle over the whole thing. I did like 4 coats of this. That was like 2 tubs of spackling, so that's a lot of spackle that I used, about $25 or so. But that was the main expense of this. You could probably forego sanding if you don't have any obvious seams, or if you just want to cover all your seams up with like hot glue welds or something, just to make it look a little bit more Fallout Raidery. Then I went through and sanded everything. Yeah, this definitely took the most amount of time just to try to get it decently smooth. I did leave a lot of just the chips and everything, just so that it looked pretty worn. Then I went through and covered it in some metallic spray paint. After that, I went through and did some weathering just by dabbing on a bunch of different shades of brown paint, just working up from a dark umber up to almost a pastel orange color, just because that was what I had on hand. But I just gradually mixed them together and let each layer dry just to give it a nice rusted effect. And then by the time I got to orange, I just really lightly dabbed that on just to give it a nice orange rust in some areas. And I did this on all of the armor pieces. I also just dabbed it on in some spots where I felt like the metal might have got worn against, and then it might have oxidized in the rain or something. And then especially on the helmet, I just made it look like the helmet had been face first in some water or something, and so the face of it's pretty rusted. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how all the rust and everything turned out. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with how this whole thing turned out. I did do some minor add-ins with some Velcro and stuff just to add some strapping to it to hold everything together while I wear it, but it's really easy to walk around in. My visibility is not that great just because the helmet just has this little teeny tiny slot to see through, so I can't really see anything below that. But yeah, it's a really great costume. I'm definitely going to be wearing it to a con. I actually wore it on Halloween and I got a lot of good feedback on it, so that was great. This build was entirely sponsored by my Patreons. They sponsored basically all of the paint that I used on this, so that was epic. So thank you guys, Patreons. If you guys don't mind liking and subscribing, this has probably been my most requested build, since I do a bunch of Fallout props. So I finally got that, and hopefully just in time for around 500 subs. That's awesome, guys, so thank you for that. So let me know what you guys want me to make, and I'll get making it. See you guys next vid. Bye.